A warning. This episode has graphic descriptions of violent crime. Please listen with care.
A listener production.
When Bob Chappell vanished from his yacht in Hobart, suspicion quickly turned on his partner, Sue Neill-Fraser, an unassuming woman who soon found herself at the centre of one of Australia's most controversial murder cases. But behind the headlines lies a deeper story. One of forensic failure, investigative tunnel vision, and a conviction that may never have happened if all the available avenues had been investigated. In this episode, former detective Colin McLaren unpacks crucial DNA evidence, the overlooked clues on the yacht, and the questions raised by a mysterious yellow Ford. This is a story about how forensics should work and what happens when it doesn't. My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author, and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
Sue Neill-Fraser is a woman that lives in Tasmania, in Hobart, way back when this crime was alleged to have happened. She would have been a grandmother approaching 60. She was a reasonably not well-to-do, but comfortable lady. She had a good upbringing, and she had reached retirement age. She was in a de facto relationship. I might refer to that as the husband. But he was a man who was, back then, at the beginning of this, when it was alleged to have happened and when he disappeared, he might have been a man in his late 60s. If he was alive, he would be in his late 70s plus. Bob Chappell, the husband, as we say, de facto. And they'd been living together, I think, about 12 or 15 years. It was a reasonable relationship. They were prone to squabbles like every couple. It wasn't a demonstratively obvious marriage of passion, or I guess they both were going through the motions, but they were by family in a sound relationship, an ongoing relationship. And then one day they decided, let's buy a yacht, because they were yachters, or whatever those
Yachties, I think.
Yeah, I know nothing about any of that. But they are yachties, or were, and they had a great passion for it and wanted to have that retirement dream of getting in a largish yacht, not a little tiny one, and taking off around Australia or wherever. And they bought themselves a large yacht. It's important to know that. A large yacht, when you get into it, it's like being in a small apartment. It's that big. There is a galley, which is a yachty term for kitchen, and there's a proper and separate toilet and shower area and 3 bedrooms, I think, and an engine room. And so it's like having an apartment under the deck. One of the first things I noticed when I did go onto that yacht eventually was how roomy it was. It really was a big yacht. In actual fact, on the night of the alleged disappearance or death of Bob, it was the largest yacht on Sandy Bay. Now, Sandy Bay is, I think it's fair to say, it's one of the first suburbs of Hobart. It's right near the centre of town, just a kilometre away. And very famous, very beautiful Bayside suburb. And it has its Sandy Bay Yacht Club and a couple of other yacht clubs nearby. They're very yachty down there. And Sue and Bob were part of that clique. and they lived in Sandy Bay, about a kilometre's walk up the hill, and they were just Mr. and Mrs. Normal, and there's not much more to say about them. And then one day, Bob disappeared off the yacht and was never seen again. And I'll make this comment from the beginning. You could easily say he just ran away.
Now, the police did what the police often do and looked first at the closest family of the victim. And within a reasonably short time, she was arrested, tried and jailed.
This is a textbook example of tunnel vision. And you're going to hear some comments against the police department. And I stand by those comments. But you've got to understand the Tasmania Police Department. I'm sure most of them are very wonderful, dedicated people, but they don't have a lot of murders down there in Hobart. Whereas, say, for Victoria or New South Wales, you might get 70, 80 murders, homicides, suspicious deaths. Certainly, they have homicide squads in Melbourne and Sydney, very big offices, and they might be involved in the investigation of multiple homicides or serial killer or bombing or atrocities that go on with big cities around the world, Sydney and Melbourne. In small town Hobart, you might get 1 or 2 suspicious deaths a year. So your skill rate is limited compared to, say, the boys on the mainland. And I think that plays a big part in understanding this crime, if it is a crime. I say that again because Bob just disappeared.
How did you become involved in the case?
I didn't want to get involved in it, but around about 2015, I was really busy and didn't have the time to sort of put my head into another subject matter. But I got a call from a woman I didn't know or never heard of, a woman called Eve Ash. And she was a documentary filmmaker, and she was involved in documenting the previous 5 or 7 years of this saga, the Sue Neill-Fraser saga. And she had a certain position on it, believing that that Bob's disappearance was more complicated than what the police were saying. And by this stage, 2015, certainly Sue Neill-Fraser had been arrested, charged with murder of her husband, and was undergoing a sentence in the high security prison of Hobart. And Eve had taken the position that Sue Neill-Fraser was innocent. And she asked to meet me, and I said, I'll give you half a day. And I met her at the door of her house, and she has a very impressive big home. And there was a room about sort of 4 or 5 metres by 4 or 5 metres, and every inch of those walls was covered in mug shots and maps and graphs and charts and photographs and clippings. It was like being with Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. This woman really had lost herself to this investigation, her investigation, because she was convinced that Sue Neill-Fraser was innocent. And I had to stop her after about half an hour telling me that Sue Neill-Fraser was innocent. And I just said, let's look at all the stuff you've got here. And at the end of this half a day, I'll tell you what I think. And that's how we started.
What stood out to you immediately when you started looking at the case?
What I noticed initially, if I can actually preface the rest of the comment by saying this, after 4 hours, after I told Eve that I'll make my own mind up and let's just read the material, I was convinced Sue Neill-Fraser was innocent. Back on the subject, the yacht is the crime scene. There is a secondary crime scene, which is the dinghy. There is a little dinghy that was attached to the yacht. And anybody that knows about crime scenes, there's always a primary crime scene or the initial crime scene, then there's a secondary crime scene. And if, for example, if there's then a gun found 100 yards away, that becomes the third and subsequent crime scene, and you would treat that as a separate location. If it's, for example, inside of a dump master, then that dump master gets preserved and searched properly, and all sorts of processes and forensics would go into that dump master. So just by explanation, there certainly wasn't any dump master here, but we had a primary crime scene of a yacht, which seemed to have had no forensics done to it at all. And what little bit had been through it or had touched that crime scene, the forensics was very selective and full of gaps and lots of question marks from me. I'd been to a lot of crime scenes, not just homicides, but also major crime scenes where you've got, say, malicious woundings, or you've got bank robberies, and where you've got a lot of exhibits, and even the old days of safe breaks. And there's a lot of reasons. Rape scenes, for example, I've been to many of those, and you go about preserving those crime scenes and getting on with crime scenes principles and procedures. You can't forget those two terms. We have a set of procedures and principles, and that was odd for a homicide of this note, because they were treated in a way like celebrities only because it was on a big yacht. So the media took the position, particularly the Sunday media, Sunday papers, that it was a celebrity type murder. First of all, you didn't have a body. It's very hard to get a conviction for any homicide without a body. How do you know it's a murder? Why can't it be a wounding? Why can't it be a suicide? There was blood. There was blood spatter throughout that little apartment, that underneath in the yacht. There was blood spatter here, there, and blood drips and all sorts of traces of blood. There was a whole smorgasbord of evidence. So I was very much on the side of Eve Ash by this stage. And that's all healthy. It's okay. I'd come to that conclusion independently. Then what happened is, I guess with all detectives, something needled at me. It's just like something gets at you and you can't think of anything else. Even though you've got other work on and you're really busy, I kept falling back to thinking, how did this woman get convicted? And where is this man? He could be in the Caribbean on a banana lounge sipping pina coladas. I mean, why not? It happened to Olivia Newton-John when she had a boyfriend, and he was found allegedly he was dead, and eventually he was found in the Caribbean on a banana lounge. So he could have faked his death. He could have just cut himself because he was repairing the yacht, and he could have fell overboard because he was a very unfit, unathletic man of mid or late 60s. So he could have easily fallen off his yacht and just been swept away through these strong currents that were in Sandy Bay, very famous currents of Sandy Bay, which moved very quickly. So there was no explanation for me, for a court to come up with this conviction. And then the more I focused on it, the more I then looked at it and studied it, and then got into the sort of cult of Hobart with the police and the judiciary. I soon formed the opinion that it was a bit clubbish, and I felt that it was a bit of a unsafe conviction, and I thought I was then obligated to give it my best shot. And I didn't want to meet the family or have much to do with the family, because you lose your objectivity. And I certainly did not want to ever meet Sue Neill-Fraser, even though she was in jail. I had to be objective and not meet her. So I set about assisting Eve and going down to Tasmania. I think I went down maybe 10 or 12 times, each time for 2 to 5 nights over a period of about 2 years. And I just applied my crime scene principles and procedures. The great thing we had, which allowed me to do that, was the yacht still existed, even though it was some years later, and the yacht had been confiscated by police. It was up in dry dock for many, many years, and it actually somehow finished up being sold from her, and the man who owned the dry dock bought it, and he'd never used it. So what we had is a preserved crime scene. And anybody who's studied forensic It's a gift. It was a matter of unlocking the cabin door and turning on some lights, and there is the crime scene many years later, but undisturbed. No one had even cleaned it properly, and it hadn't gone through any refurbishment on any level. So I just applied myself, and I got a lawyer who was from Hobart. I didn't know him, but I got to know him. And I had the lawyer stand with me as I searched the yacht, and then I had it filmed. So it was heavily witnessed and heavily documented by film and audio, and went about my work for many, many days and come up with a white paper, which was I think it was about a 58-page document that showed that the entire investigation was deeply flawed and all these clues were completely missing. It's like, say, Robert Louis Stevenson puts together a novel of Treasure Island, and it's all about a map of all the clues on that island that's going to take you to the end of the map. And there's the pot of gold, there's the answer, there's your forensic answer. But unfortunately, this police department didn't have a map. But they got the pot of gold, they got the lady locked away. But I think because of that clubbish atmosphere in Tasmania, in Hobart, there was no map, and I had to start doing the map myself. And in doing the map, I remember doing some whiteboards and some sketches and all sorts of ways of preserving evidence. Once I left the crime scene, we found that there was a hatch, an escape hatch, or again, my terminology is wrong, but one of those air vents that a human body can crawl out of if you had to leave the cabin of the yacht. And we noticed that of the few photos that were taken, not for this purpose, but just for other purposes, there was a rope dangling in from this hatch. And there was also a blue-covered lounge suite under the hatch. So you can imagine it's like a lounge room. You have a galley, a little dining area, and a lounge area. And there was all these vertical drops of blood on the cushions of the lounge suite. And they were vertical. They weren't spatters. They weren't as if something had hit the lounge suite. They were just neatly, like little pencils of blood going down. And when you look up from where those blood drips were, there's the hatch and there's a rope dangling in. And then when you look at the hatch and the casing of the hatch, once you open I guess it's fiberglass skylight, there was a piece of skin found there with hair on it. Then there was what seemed to be like rope burns on that skylight hatch, which indicated that, just from common sense reading this crime scene, something has gone out of that hatch that's a body because it's dripped blood. But they didn't know that. I found that. So that says that you need two or more people to have lifted the dead man, if he was dead, out of the yacht via the skylight hatch. And she's a woman in her, then, I think she was 59 or 60, in poor health with a bad hip, not athletic at all, and carrying some weight. And she's alleged to have killed Bob somehow. They didn't know how. They had no explanation how. They suggested she probably stabbed him with a screwdriver, but that was purely a suggestion without any evidence of any kind, any exhibits or any forensics. Yet I could come up with a proper study of the crime scene, and it's so obvious that a body has gone through and dripped blood down on the couch. So we were getting things like this, and that's only a portion of some of the contradictory forensic evidence. Then we found some swatches, what I call a swatch, of vomit, what looked like vomit, that it was on a log, and a couple of photographs of the small amount taken. Somebody had vomited inside the cabin of the yacht in the engine room or that's where the steering wheel is. If anyone knows what a yacht looks like, and you stand there steering and talking to your friends before you go out onto the deck proper. And on the deck proper, there was also a swatch of vomit there as well. But those vomit marks, like a size of a dinner plate, as if someone's vomited violently or aggressively, those 2 or 3 swatches of vomit were never taken seriously or had reports coming back as to who could own by way of DNA or those swatches of vomit and what was in that vomit, for example, alcohol or drugs or food substance. There's all sorts of toxicology studies you could do there. All of that was ignored. And then it became obvious that someone has got themselves very upset in that yacht at some point and then vomited. Why? Out of fear? Or was it Bob's vomit? Or was it somebody else's? Or was it a reaction to somebody killing somebody else? So what it did, it threw up all sorts of markers, all sorts of questions that had to be answered as a crime scene. And I'm doing this many years later, albeit in a preserved crime scene, the yacht. Then there was a thought process. The dinghy, as I mentioned, there was a secondary crime scene which was never treated as a crime scene. There was a dinghy that was on the shoreline against some rocks. And it was those rocks, and the location was unique to a car. There was a car seen there, photographed there by a police photographer. And it was a yellow Ford, an old yellow Ford, and it had been parked there for a long, long time. And right in front of it, only from 3, 4, 5 metres away, was this dinghy bobbing around, and it had no business being there. It belonged to the Four Winds yacht, which was out on the water 200 metres away on anchor. Why was this dinghy there? Now, if you then do your math, if you go through it, you come up with ideas. That's the process of being a detective or investigating. Okay, someone has killed somebody on the yacht and then they've used the dinghy to escape. That makes sense. And the dinghy's now next to an abandoned car or a car that's been parked there for a long, long time, many weeks or months. Maybe the person in the yellow car saw something or is involved. It's 2 simple questions. That's a start. You might come up with 7 questions, but there's the 2 first ones. Apparently, the police did see the occupant of the yellow car the next morning, asked him if he knew anything, and he said, "No, I was asleep." And that was it. They then walked off. Now, the same man that owns that yellow car has a criminal record and was on bail and had done jail time for malicious wounding, incredibly serious wounding, which nearly took the life of somebody. He was diagnosed a violent alcoholic and had been in and out of prisons and hospitals. So his antecedents were all wrong for him. Next to the dinghy that belongs to a yacht where allegedly a murder had taken place. Remember, there's no body, but there's a lot of clues.
So, Colin, the police in the original investigation did do some forensic examination. Can you tell us what they found?
We had a whole situation where there was a forensic scientist go onto the yacht. She had gone through the process of creating a log. And what happens is you log in the different exhibits that you're seizing or photographing or bagging up or taking away, and what the remarks are as to what reason you're doing that and what you're trying to achieve, and whether it's going to be for toxicology or it's going to be for blood and whatever. And some of that required a DNA test. And at the end of that process, which would have taken, obviously, if you can understand crime scenes and certainly for homicides, many weeks, at the end of that process, there was some outstanding DNA that they couldn't put to anybody. And it certainly wasn't Sue Neill-Fraser's DNA or Bob Chappell's DNA. So that's a question mark. Whose DNA is that? And it never was solved on these different pieces of swabbings, and then there was also blood samplings taken. So whilst they didn't have a treasure map, as I mentioned, the little they did do had enough red flags there. They should have really spent days and days on that yacht. They should have taken it to a dry dock and pulled it apart, if not for 3, 4, 5 days, for a week or more, and do it properly. And one expert after another would follow the next and follow the next. The first one in, logically, is the photographer to preserve it all by way of film, whether it's still photography or whether it's a video. And off you go. Your investigative and your forensic procedures then unfold from as much as a week.
So that DNA on the boat that was neither the victims nor the alleged killers, was an owner for that DNA ever identified before the trial?
There was a homeless girl, let's call her Sally, because she has gone through many court appearances on this case. Sally had been a street kid since she was 13. At the time of the death of Bob Chappell, if it was a death, she was 16. She was going out with a young man who was 17 and was in and out of boys' homes and prison, and was getting himself deeper into crime, a violent young man. Sally, in that 3-year period since she left home at the age of 13, had tried all sorts of drugs, lived on the streets, and engaged in prostitution and all sorts of petty crimes just to survive. And just those two alone, when you dig deep, and the DNA matching her, you start to think, well, could have this been a burglary on the yacht gone bad? We do know that the same period, the weeks leading up to this alleged death, there was a whole series of burglaries on yachts, break and enters, and things were getting stolen and sold through second-hand dealers. So there was somebody working those waters, those yachts, and stealing, and it was rampant. I then set about speaking to all of the yachting community and fishermen from Hobart and from Sandy Bay and elsewhere, and just door knocking or yacht knocking, really. And over a period of about 4 or 5 days, I had a whole list of incidents that had happened at the same time. The obvious avenue of inquiry is petty thefts by violent young offenders. So I set about trying to find this girl called Sally. That took a long, long time. And eventually I was able to sit with her, talk to her on at least 3 occasions with an audio device. I'm talking 1 to 2 hours each time. And she admitted that she would go to that area where the yellow car was. Remember, there's the owner of that yellow car's an adult. He's a man of about 36 or 38 with a violent history. They used to go to him and they would drink. They were all alcoholics or drug users, one or the other. And there was a club of this violent offenders and thieves in that immediate area, that yellow car where that dinghy was. Your avenues of inquiry as a detective are all in front of you. None of that was used in the trial. It was, in fact, covered up or hidden away. The defence tried to get the girl to get into the witness box and to be cross-examined, or at least you can't cross-examine your own, but at least go through a process of telling some story from the witness box as to why her DNA or what was she doing on the yacht. And she kept just saying, I can't remember. That was the best she could come up with, which, you know, you may or may not want to believe that with her history of drug usage and all of her antecedents. But I thought it was a convenient answer that when the too hard comes at you, you just resort to, I can't remember. Well, you know, how many detectives have heard that 1,000 times in their career? The whole investigation was flawed so bad that, to me, it was not sound. None of it was sound. None of the conclusions were sound. And it didn't seem that the defence was getting any free kicks or wasn't being listened to in the trial, or it was getting overridden by the DPP. The DPP was a fairly assertive, robust man. He challenged everything and wouldn't allow any reasonable fair play, or in the end he finished up being intoxicated and driving his high-powered Mercedes along the road after the trial and killed somebody head-on. And the more you looked into this, it just got messier and messier, and it just smacked of needing a review. So I compiled this 58-page white paper with everything I've told you and 4 or 5 times more. A whole list of witnesses I'd found, and the summary at the end pretty well demanded a reinvestigation by the homicide squad in Melbourne or in Sydney, people that would be able to apply their skills objectively to this crime scene, which is not an unusual thing in law enforcement, particularly in areas where there's been some involvement or someone's been too close to it all. You get an independent person coming in from outside, and you maybe get a judge involved or retired judge to oversee. Quite normal stuff in the Westminster system of justice. And we presented that, Robert Richter and myself, and Eve went to the Premier's office with the police minister in there and the Solicitor General, and we thought we'd get a professional, straightforward hearing, put the white paper down. They took the white paper away from us and then basically told us to get out of the office. We're sticking by our men. This case is closed, but they had our white paper. So they had my conclusions, and they had Robert Richter, who people that might know, one of the greatest defence or one of the greatest legal minds in the area of criminal behaviour and criminal trials this country's ever seen. He was part of a pro bono team. He worked alongside me or vice versa, and we presented our white paper with Eve Ash and got thrown out. And then they had what we had, and there's no doubt whatsoever they systematically went through that and just nullified everything. And by the time they got to the end, we've got a period now of about 2 years. The lawyer that initially helped me with the crime scene of the yacht by standing there near me, he gave that independent assessment that the crime scene procedure was correct and professional. He came to a prison to meet the owner of the yellow Ford, who was now in prison on serious crime offences, a bashing or attempted murder. And I developed a rapport with him to the point where he would talk to me, offered information, because normally they just tell you to F off, So you've got to develop a rapport. Eventually he started to tell us a lot of things about crimes going on there and all sorts of behaviours, and then he started to identify Sally and her boyfriend and how they were going to go off and steal. And that night, the night of the alleged killing, and it just got better and better for Sue Neill-Fraser on her side of the ledger, but it was too late. She was already serving jail time for murder. Then what happened was probably the end of my involvement. The police that initially did the investigation resurfaced and started their own task force with my white paper, dismantled everything, then started putting listening devices on the lawyer, on Eve and on myself, and our houses had listening devices, this was confirmed by an independent police department a year later. We suspected, and we were correct in suspecting this, and we were phone tapped and our houses were under listening devices, and they started mounting an investigation on us three for the offence of perverting the course of justice, because we had an opinion different to theirs.
So, Colin, in the original trial, DNA didn't play an important part. But in your examination of the evidence, DNA actually is the key to a complicated scenario in which at least probably 3 other people were on the boat and were responsible for Bob's death.
Yeah, I think this is a good example of when you ignore DNA and the answers any DNA can throw up. You start ignoring those potential answers. DNA was the answer to this crime. It would have changed it from a suspected homicide or a disappearance of a man to a confirmed homicide, because the DNA, all of those samples of DNA, had they all been properly handled and properly disclosed, the ownership would have shown, that treasure map would have shown the pot of gold, and that was all flawed, totally missing. And what we were left with was ridiculous theories thrown up by prosecutors at the trial, and they only pointed towards Sir Neill-Fraser. It was a travesty.
What you had done was, in fact, produce an alternative scenario to what happened on the boat that night, and it centred on DNA.
Well, DNA is undeniable. So if you go to any crime scene as a detective, or if you're working a crime scene as a forensic officer, even if you're just taking photographs, and you see something that is either blood tissue or skin tissue or blood or saliva or semen, or there's a whole range of things you can think of, then you have a process that immediately follows, and that process does not stop and does not get broken all the way through to the conclusion to the courthouse. And that's incredibly important to the whole process. What we had was aspects of DNA coming forward, and for example, you mentioned the vomit rags, or the vomit that was there, the swatches of vomit. We had these fluids or these compounds that were on the 3 different locations on the yacht. They would yield a DNA result, whether it's from the saliva within that, whatever it was. Say it's vomit, or say it's dry reach. I actually thought professionally, I thought it was dry reaching. Someone was just wasn't vomiting up so much food, but they were just vomiting up bodily fluids. All of that's going to be DNA'd. But no, it wasn't. When you look at the log sheets from the only forensic person that did a log sheet for the police, who soon after resigned from the police department and went to live in Ireland, the Isle of Man, I think it was. And we had great troubles trying to get access to her. What happened with her log sheet of all the things she sees that should have followed all the way through the trial and been analysed for DNA and the result, some of those items just fell off the log sheet, disappeared.
But some of those items were analysed, and they all had the DNA of this young woman on them.
Some of them did, but some of them also were person unknown. There was a number of other pieces as well.
But you could construct a scenario of what happened that night through the DNA, through the various stains. And what was your scenario of what happened that night?
I believe that this Sally girl and her boyfriend, and most likely the fellow in the yellow Ford, or one of his friends, there was another fellow involved as well, and I won't name for obvious legal reasons. 3 of them went onto the yacht to steal because they saw that there was no lights on. The yacht was bobbing along. It's the biggest yacht on that harbour. And they also noticed that the dinghy was tied up to the shore, which indicates that no one's home on the yacht, because when you come off a yacht in your dinghy, you always tie the dinghy up near the yacht house. And that's what happens. That's why there's always little dinghies alongside a yacht house. So they used the dinghy to go out with a purpose of stealing. They got on. It was late. Everything was in darkness. Bob's an older chap. He was older than his years. And he's asleep. He'd finished his repair work or just gone to bed without making it too complicated. They've ransacked the place not knowing there's a man asleep. He's got up, there's a fight, and the Sally girl at some point said in her interview process with 60 Minutes and with myself separately and others that there was a fight. She actually admitted being on the yacht, told the story to 60 Minutes, told the story separately to me, and there had been a fight take place, and I believe that she vomited because she was scared, got off the yacht, and somebody in that club of people, whether it's her boyfriend or the fellow from the yellow Ford or his mate, bashed Bob to death, hence all the blood. Body was taken out through the skylight hatch with a rope and all the drips of blood coming down. And the body was thrown into the water with the strong currents. There are particularly strong currents at that exact point. We know that absolutely because the suicides that come off the bridge at the Derwent River Bridge in Hobart, there's a number of suicides over the years and they never find them because the currents take them right out to the open ocean. So you rarely find a suicide or a jumper from a suicide. So we know that the body is probably just through current disappeared out into the open ocean. And whether Sally got onto the dinghy or the others, the whole crew, and ultimately came back to the yellow car, and there's the dinghy bobbing along right next to the yellow car. And then at daylight, somebody out walking seen the same yacht taking water. They've tried to cause the yacht to sink, but it hasn't happened. It's too big a yacht. But he noticed that it's tilting and raised the alarm, so there's not enough time for it to actually sink. If it had sunk, of course, it would have been the end of it at any crime scene.
Your involvement in this investigation have had massive consequences for you personally.
Well, I didn't think I'd ever get to the stage of ever being arrested by any police department anywhere in the world. And here it was, we found out through the police themselves, through disclosure material, that not only was I arrested, there's no doubt that happened, but leading up to that arrest, I'd had many, many months of my house being bugged, listening devices. My phone was off as well. And I'd even caught the technicians coming out of my own apartment to retrieve the devices. That's how crazy it all was. To go through that it makes you feel as dirty as you can imagine. And then all your friends hearing about it. And then you're trying to, of course, explain it as if you're innocent. But the pervert the course of justice is a really bad tag for a detective to wear. Detective, pervert the course of justice. They're two opposites. They shouldn't be in the same game. So it just means that you're dirty. So I had to fight to clear myself. But what I did, I got interviewed, and then they got back to me and they said, "You're free to go. We've heard too much. There's something really bad going on here. It's not you, and we're not happy with the way things have played out. You're free to leave. You've got a passport. Off you go." So I was able to clear my name totally. But I had to go through the dirt for that 1 year period of being arrested and interviewed and clear myself. But my last word is my sympathy, my great sympathy for that solicitor who I'd never met before, who just happened to want to be a good citizen and a pro bono lawyer by helping Sue. He was charged for the same offence 4 years and spent $200,000 trying to clear his name. It was just a dirty game.
Now, you said before that you never met Sue. Have you ever heard from her?
No. I had heard only recently, it's years later, that she would like to telephone me to thank me for what I did, but I haven't picked up on that. I've just moved on. I wish her well, and I know in my heart of hearts that she's totally innocent. That's all I need.
So she's now out on parole, but has never been exonerated. Would you ever go back to Tasmania now?
I think I'd be an idiot to. I love Tasmania as a state, as a producer of Pinot Noir, and for their food produce and their organic way of life. But I can't ever go back there.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Dan Mullins and Jade Murray. Sound design is by Link Kelly. This podcast is produced on Wurundjeri and Gadigal lands. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations listeners.